Michael. Thanks, Michael.
Hey everyone, Michael Jones here. I'm the risk analyst for Portfield region. So my primary role is to look at where we can get the best benefits in risk reduction from planned burning across the region. So I'll be chatting to you a little bit today about some of the bushfire risk and with a bit of a localised lens looking at Healesville. So I thought I'd start off with talking a little bit about fire history in the area. So this is looking at the 1939 Black Friday bushfire. So same year as World War II started, so quite a while ago. But I mean, this fire was absolutely massive. It covered majority of the east of the state, and it did impact the Healesville township itself. Then fast forwarding a little bit to 1962, which is the green polygons you can see there. We got there's a fire that impacted Chum Creek, so if anyone's from there, what I'm trying to get across is this part of the world is, fire isn't a new concept here. It's part of the landscape, and it's something that we have to kind of acknowledge and live with. And then most recently, everyone would have been around for this fire. 2009, the Black Saturday Murrindindi Kilmore fire impacted Chum Creek and actually spotted into Healesville. Came very close, and luckily there was a southwesterly wind change, which changed the direction of that fire and pushed it further up north, and it didn't actually end up impacting the Healesville township. And I'll just show the next slide, which shows in purple is just other fire history from 1927 until the present. And then in the orange there, that's Ash Wednesday. So it didn't impact Healesville, but it's still quite close and still quite local. Impacted Warburton, Powtown, Upper Beaconsfield and Cockatoo. Pretty major bushfire event. So I'll just give a bit of an overview of risk modelling. So to get an understanding of how bushfire behaves and interacts with the landscape, we used a fire model called Phoenix Rapid Fire. It's an empirical fire characterisation model, and we have several different inputs we put into it. So we input fuels, so what's actually on the ground. Is it really heavy fuel loads, quite dense? Is there lots of bark fuel? Is there lots of surface fuel? Is the fire going to travel easily through it, or is it going to be held up by a road or a massive fuel disruption? We input wind and weather, topography. So like Nigel was saying, if the fire is travelling uphill, it's going to travel at twice the rate of spread for every 5 degrees increase in topography. We input assets and values in the landscape. So, where are homes? Are there any important catchments we need to be aware of? Obviously, we want to protect our water supply as much as possible. And we can also input suppression into the fire model. So, I'll just give a bit of an example of Phoenix running. So this is a recreation of the Black Saturday Kilmore Murrindindi fire. Starts up near Kilmore. The white outline there is the actual fire progression on the day, and the coloured pixels are Phoenix's prediction of how the fire is going to spread. So fairly accurate. In terms of predicting the fire spread. It's not 100%. No model is 100% accurate to the real world, but it's the best available science that we have. And just a bit of an overview of bushfire modelling. So when we analyse bushfires, we look at, we light ignitions across the landscape. Ignition, so just a fire starting at that point. And we simulate thousands of these across the landscape. And from that, and it's important to know that these fires are running independently of one another, so they won't actually interact, they just display together. from that, we have the ability to understand where high-risk areas are in the landscape. So where an area will be impacted more frequently than an area that's perhaps in less risk. So if we look out in the western grasslands at Sunbury, and we light thousands of ignitions to the north of Sunbury, they're going to have less impact if we light the same amount of ignitions north of Healesville. So getting an understanding of that and actually being able to quantify that amount of risk. And I'll just talk a little bit about weather as well. So we have automated weather stations around the state. So the one for this area is the one at Coldstream, and this is a look at a 15-year data set of weather, and it's a look at return intervals of bad fire weather in the area. So our worst fire day that we'll get quite regularly would be a FDI 75 or a severe fire weather day. If we're looking at extreme and code red days, they're likely a 1 in every 10-year occurrence. So a lot of our planning and fuel management is done to consider that severe day rather than that code red day, because there's a bit of a limitation on what fuel management can do under Black Saturday code red fire conditions. So this is an example of one of the mapping products we can get from Phoenix. So this is an output of house loss risk under FDI 130 conditions with no fire history. So that means that fuels are at their absolute maximum in the landscape. So this map displays house loss risk at that code red condition, and it shows where the potential for the most houses to be destroyed under the FDI 130 conditions within the region. So the black represents top 5% of the highest risk areas in terms of house loss risk from bushfire. So just a bit of a zoom in there for this area. Healesville is within that top 5%, along with Warburton, Warrandyte and Dandenong Ranges. So it's just kind of a factual piece of information. Moving on to our fire management, which we do on public land. So from those thousands of emissions that we simulate in Phoenix, we can also get an understanding of what impact fuel management will have in the landscape. So if we burn areas of bushfire moderation zone, which I'll elaborate on, if we burn those on a frequent basis, we can understand that, okay, that area, if we treat it a lot, will reduce the risk to, say, Healesville more than if we treat another area to the south. So, and with our public lands fire management zoning, we know that we can't prevent bushfires from occurring, but we can reduce the impact of these bushfires to life and property. So that's their main purpose, is to reduce the impact of bushfires to life and property. So asset protection zones are the areas in red. These are our highest priority for protection. These are usually quite close to a township, and we treat these very regularly, every 5 to 8 years. So we can treat them either through planned burning, or we can treat them through fuel modification. So getting a mulcher in there and treating some of the understory vegetation, and actually removing it and turning it into surface.
So what is the red zone there, actually?
The red zone here is, talking about like what?
Geographically?
Geographically.
Where is it?
Where is it?
Where is it?
Where is it? Henderson's Hill, just up near the Marina Reservoir Park.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Sorry. I didn't quite understand the question.
Yeah. Not that far from here.
In your backyard.
Bushfire moderation zones. So the aim of bushfire moderation zones is to reduce the speed and intensity of large landscape bushfires, and we treat these areas quite regularly, so every 8 to 12 years, on an annual rotation of every 8 to 12 years. A lot of the area to the north, up in Paul's Range, is zoned as bushfire moderation zone to try and prevent large bushfires coming from King Lake and impacting the Healesville area, and also on Mount Toogoolong. Landscape management zones. So these are areas which have, they're the areas in green on the map. So these are areas which have less impact on reducing bushfire risk. So we've identified that through our modelling. So what we do for these areas is we actually prioritise maintaining them for ecological purposes. So we burn there when it's necessary for the ecology. So typically, since we've had a lot of fire history within the landscape management zones in Port Phillip, we don't burn there often because the landscape management zones need time to recover from the recent fires. But in 20, 30 years, we might start doing a bit more of a landscape mosaic in there. If we do burn in landscape management zones, we typically only treat about 20 to 30% of a 2,000 hectare block. So very low intensity and only treating north facing slopes aspects. And planned burn exclusion zones, there's a bit of change in symbology here. Blue on the smaller map and kind of aqua on the bigger map. We don't burn or treat these areas at all. These areas are typically intolerant to bush or to any fire. So these are your mountain ash forests, which are quite wet and intolerant to fire. And last but not least, bushfire risk engagement areas. So this is a new bit of work which we've developed. It's detailed in our bushfire management strategy. So there's plain copies here if you want to take some home with you. And these are parts of the landscape where we've identified that fuel management would be the most effective in reducing bushfire risk. And these are tenure blind as well. So these cover private land and public land. So the purpose of these areas is to indicate where the priorities for fuel management on private public land. So Healesville and the surrounding townships have been identified as bushfire risk engagement areas. But it's also important to note that there's no legal obligation for these bushfire risk engagement areas. They're simply an informative tool. And that's about it for me. I'm sure there's plenty of questions, and I'm sure others are going to let you know how we can answer your questions.